the companies winning with AI aren't the ones with the biggest budgets. They're the ones who are starting right now. If you've been waiting for someone to cut through the noise and show you exactly how AI could transform your work, your wait is over. Your competitors have already signed up. I'm Kenny, founder of Brim and the host of the AI Opportunity.
Super excited. This week we've got Ben Byford. So Ben, you are going to be great for this show because I think you have an amazing perspective. Just for the audience's context, so Ben is an AI ethicist. I think I'm going to let him tell you a bit more about what that means, but he has a really interesting background, been in what as leadership roles for the last 20 years, works in games design and has a games business, and actually has really started to focus his attention now on how technology is going to change the world and what the ethical perspective of that is. Ben, super excited to have you on the show. Welcome.
Hi, Kenny.
Maybe you can tell us a little bit more about what is an AI ethicist and a bit more about yourself, because as I said, I think we're really excited to talk to you today.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, so I've been kind of talking about AI and ethics for 10 years now. So I got into this around about 2015. And about that time, I was in London and there was lots of startup stuff. So I had my own kind of web startup, which was connecting academia with businesses. So had a web platform for matchmaking that. Went to all these things in London, and a lot of the hype at that time was around big data analytics, and it was coming into machine learning stuff because in 2012 or something like that, we had a load of the vision stuff really taking root, using neural networks to be able to use large data sets and actually do something useful with those. We started getting all this data from the internet, and at the time I was looking around me, and I was a web developer and I was trying to start this business, and I was interested in startup stuff and all this sort of technology. I was seeing Siri and Alexa and all these things starting to appear, and what was striking me at the time was these things are in your home and they're not very secure. And now private entities have like a direct link into your house and your behavior. So I was kind of thinking about how that's going to change society around about, how we change our behavior because of these things, these technology things entering our lives. So at that point, I was like, that is so interesting. Maybe I will start a podcast talking about this stuff. And 10 years later, I'm still doing it. So you said I was an AI ethicist. But that didn't exist 10 years ago, right? It was AI was just becoming this ML thing, machine learning. AI was not that. And then suddenly it was AI is ML when people were talking about it. And then we're sort of looking at these dilemmas with the automated cars, but also like a dilemma of the YouTube algorithm and all the Facebook, like social media was a dilemma as well with big data. What happens if you show people lots of bad content and focus them down a way of thinking? So there's all these kind of ethical questions around that. And can we automate that? Can we make that machine learning thing? So there's all these ethical things with technology, and the whole AI thing became more of a kind of a public talking point in businesses and generally in the news. But before that, we weren't really talking about it. If you look before kind of 2016, there wasn't an AI ethics. There was robot ethics, there was computer ethics, but there wasn't AI ethics. But now there is AI ethics. And really, it's this idea of when you make, design, and deploy something which has kind of autonomous systems, it's hard to kind of like nail down exactly what it is, but has AI-ness in it, then you want to think about it in this way. And that's the body of work that AI ethics is talking about.
Yeah, it's really interesting because I do appreciate that for some people, when they hear the word AI ethics, it might feel super abstract and unclear. But I like to think about what you talk about and the topics that you are trying to broach is similar to what life would have felt like at very important moments in history. So whenever something seismic changes in society, we do start to see new ideas, deep discourse around like how society is shaped, the rules of it. You think of actually a lot of the philosophers in modern, kind of the modern Western world, right? And it's like Adam Smith, a Brit. We're both Brits, right? Adam Smith is a Brit. Why were his ideas sort of listened to and became prominent? Well, it's about market shifts and industrial shift, right? Because of the industrial revolution. Or you think of like closer to our time, Karl Marx, right? And Karl Marx was really a reaction to essentially the inequalities of industrialization, right? Like, you
Hmm.
know, the masses having nothing and capitalism starting to kind of eat itself, right? Or you think about John Stuart Mill and kind of this idea of freedom, right? And how because of the changing views of what was happening around central control. And it feels to me that
Mm.
AI is such a big societal change that we are going to need new ideas, right? About how we organize ourselves, about how we think about what does humanity mean? What does it mean to be human? What does it mean to exist? That sounds
Mm.
very deep, but you know, I think it's the sort of question we're going to be asking. And what does it mean to be actualized? Well, you know, the philosophy of Nietzsche was brought on by a collapse in religion, right? I
Mm.
think we're about to see a collapse in many of the things that underpin our current beliefs around society, right? So things like taxation, even concepts like social democracy, right? You know, how power is distributed. I think there's a
Mm.
lot that we're about to see change in. It'll be really good to get your thoughts on that because, you know, AI ethicist, AI philosopher, for me, we have questions to really be answering at this moment in history. And I don't think it's any different to other moments where there are significant change and a requirement to reevaluate some of the tenets of kind of how we live. So
Mm.
what do you think are the big questions that are going to need to be answered in this kind of coming world?
I think you're completely right. Like in this endeavor, right, of looking at AI and looking at ethics, for me, it really comes back to we can make this tiny thing slightly less biased, right? But in terms of the structural issues, this slightly less biased algorithm is going to be put into the market, and we still have market forces, and that might push it into a different direction, or it might be implemented badly because of those forces, which is not a very good way of describing the fact that a lot of the work that I've seen really comes back to what is the thing that we live in, what is the world, the structural stuff that we live in, the economic situation. And this kind of capital situation is probably the problem. And I say that in terms of, I had a stint at a government org doing AI stuff, doing ethics consultation and trying to build ethics into the pipeline of what they're building and stuff like that. And a lot of the kind of pressures go away when your pressure is to essentially deliver under budget, all that sort of stuff. But aside from that, it's to do good by your citizens, right? And in the market, the private sector, the forces are very different from that. And the kind of doing good by your citizens is almost a tertiary thing, which sounds the complete opposite directions. I think we would be in a very different place right now if we actually had a different structural economic system. Which is sad, basically. Like, I think we could do a lot better than we're currently doing. So that's one thing. And then there's, in the future, where are we heading, right? How are we going to change the system? Because the system isn't built for this AI thing, basically. This AI thing is, if we do it slowly and well, it's going to be fine. What we are doing is not slow and well, you know what I mean? So I can only imagine it going badly for us economically. By badly, I mean unemployment, kind of structural inequality. There's going to be, the people talk about techno feudalism. There's going to be this distribution of power, which is going to be unequal. And this combined with environmental pressures, like there is, for me, seemingly, like some people haven't obviously, but like governments haven't been doing enough. And I think part of that is the pressure of the economic situation. Like they're incentivized on a very small timescale to do the best decision making for the long term, basically. So what I'm really keen on at the moment is thinking about how we take this technology, how we kind of work with it, and how we use it, but how we use it. I mean, responsibly, it's kind of a bit of a AI. Responsible AI is a bit of a kind of business term, I would say. But responsible is probably the right term. Like, be responsible by the planet, be responsible for other citizens, and to do things which aren't using us like a science experiment, basically, and then probably having a think where we're going. Like, I don't know if people were, other than the transhumanists, I don't think anyone else has a good idea of where we're going, right? I think that's the problem.
So I think there's a few points that you've made. So there's one point really, which is a questioning of like, do we currently have the right system, right? Capitalism, a system which you've kind of characterized as a bit somewhat zero sum. Is that a system that at its very core is just structurally wrong for a future where AI is such a big part of our society, right? And then it's a question, the second point is, if you start with capitalism the way we currently have it now, which you have question marks about, and I don't sort of disagree, and we look forwards, what does the world look like, right? And your view is that probably not a very good place, right? Is that fair to say, based on where we're headed and what we're doing right now? And I think they're really interesting points. I mean, we're probably scaring the hell out of the audience right now, so it might be worthwhile us kind of explaining and maybe trying to detangle a bit of that. But I guess the core point here is that right now we live in a system where everyone is incentivized to acquire capital and to use that capital to acquire more capital. That's the premise of capitalism, right? The acquisition of capital. And when you take what is essentially a dynamic like that, and then you apply a new technology like AI, which can actually supercharge those pretensions, you end up in an environment where the pursuit of capital above all other things might see those other things severely damaged. And those other things that you're talking about are things like employment. And I think actually the employment one's a really interesting point, because we live in Britain. I think we all love good old Blighty. It's a beautiful place, right? Like, you can see the British spring in your background. But Britain as a nation, when you look at its economy, it is heavily slanted towards services. It's a service industry economy. We really don't build anything anymore, right? And arguably, depending on what your political persuasions are, our current kind of political direction is increasingly about kind of being, people, men and women who essentially are focused on services, right? And I guess the big risk is that that's probably the industry that gets hit the hardest by AI. So what is your view about AI and employment? And then maybe we can move to how do we make the right decisions so that we don't have these negative impacts. But I think a lot of people would be really interested in the employment point,
Yeah, definitely. So I think to your point about capital, I think there's a distinction between people who have capital and can apply and create more wealth through applying capital, and there's people who work to create capital. So there's kind of a schism there. And I think what you were saying about the Industrial Revolution is probably a useful analogy, because you had this kind of pseudo class system. They had this class system, right? So there were already have and have-nots, and then you apply industrialization to it, and the haves acquire more of the new wealth, right? The created wealth. So there is a parallel there, where there are people who are likely, I'm not saying this is, but it seems likely to acquire the new or suck up the wealth that is already there in certain workplaces and stuff. And there are new things you can do with AI. So there's this new wealth, but there's also usurping things that we currently do with people. So there's this kind of like, there's two things essentially that the AI might replace, in that it might make new things, and it might kind of usurp old things, old processes that we were doing, and create wealth that way. There's more and more wealth, basically. So there's that issue, and that's like a problem that we can solve now, essentially, but it's unlikely that we will be able to solve in the future, because the more and more wealth, power that someone accumulates, it's less likely that we will be able to counteract the power that they, with our lessening power, essentially. It's like a weird, it's like a game theory thing, or like a strategy game. So there is that issue. And then going forward, there is like these ideologies, right? And they're born out of the technology and somewhat out of science fiction and how we think about technology. So there's these transhumanists who think we should embrace technology, should become more entwined with technology, and maybe even cross over into pseudo-human and an android type situation. And this sounds really fanciful, right? But you already have a phone and you outsource, decision making to AIs, and you already have a memory, which is Google. And you know what I mean? There's a fuzzy middle ground, which we're already kind of in, which we can get closer to. And these people, they think it's great. I mean, it's like we're on the right path, right? And we're doing the right things. And we should be doing more of that. And I don't know with this economic situation whether that's a good thing or not. And it's probably, again, it's a bad thing. But whether we have a lot of jobs in the future, or we're going to get to this position where the government's going to have to decide, right, what direction to go. And it might be, it's great. Being an AI ethicist, it's our job, or like it's part of our thinking process to kind of get at the edges, find the negative issues, find all the perspectives which people need to think about and present it, right? But it's funny because one of the positions you could take is it will be good, And by that, I mean, we may not have to work anymore. Like you're saying with the service industries, all these industries are going to go away probably. And let's not fill it with anything. Let's fill it with, let's say, a philosophical term like flourishing, right? Let's actually, our job now is to work out what flourishing is for humanity, right? And that's what we need to do going forward. And like flippantly, for me, flourishing might be having close ties with family, having a close community, having sports activities, having creative activities, being able to self-actualize through some sort of craft or work craft thing. There's these things which we kind of know that humanity or like humans want and do and enjoy. So I want to paint this really good picture first, where we're like, it goes well. We've somehow sorted out the centralized power situation. We have loads more free time. And actually, the existential crisis is, what do we do with that time? And how do we move forward as a society that doesn't have to grind like every day? And I feel like that's the story we're being sold, right? That's like, the Sam Altmans and stuff like that. The heads of these AI companies, they know that it could go badly through the use of technology, or the technology having some sort of awakening or problematic thing that goes on. But if it does go well, it might be great. And we actually have to think about the crisis of what great means afterwards. I suggest that it probably won't go like that after I've just described all that stuff. So what happens if it doesn't go great and you've got this power imbalance, like I said before? But it might be that all these industries go away, and then we have lots of unemployment, and then basically whole societies like cease to function. Like as soon as you get more than 10%, 20% people unemployed, the whole house of cards comes down basically. So I think we should be thinking really seriously about that and how we move this economic situation to a place where we identify what this flourishing thing is in light of just being lots of people. There's so much stuff that actually people do. And if you reflect on your job, you're likely to find that a lot of your job is probably drudgery, and you probably like a certain percentage of your job, which is probably not 100%. But a lot of people have jobs that they actually don't need to do, like society doesn't necessarily need them to do, and that's a awkward bar to find. It's like because that could be anywhere for different people. So, for example, my bar is like I need something over my head, right? I need fresh water, I need food, I need probably access to other people, maybe pens and pencils and musical instruments. And that's kind of my bar, right? Other people will need television, for instance. And television on its own requires lots of stuff to happen. So we're up here, and if we come down here, like how far do we come down? That will make more people in the world flourish, but also and happy, but you know what I mean? But it requires us to understand that we actually live in a situation which is completely ridiculous right now, and that most of the world's population don't have anything near to what we have.
Yeah, I think just to interject, I think again, so much.
Yeah, it's a bit of a tangent because obviously coming from the AI, it's like the repercussions of that is like we should solve like poverty and world hunger and stuff like that.
No, but I mean these are all really important points. But I mean essentially what you're saying is that if we go through this AI transition and we end up in a kind of post-abundance world. We
Yes.
have other questions to ask
Yeah,
ourselves,
exactly.
like what do we do with our time? How do we actualize ourselves? I think these are all really important points. I think there's something you said that was particularly interesting and also equally scary, which you talked about, if unemployment gets to 10% plus, like a lot of our current systems just don't work anymore, right? They
Yep.
simply don't work, right? Taxation doesn't work. Questions around social democracy, because if you've got more than 10-20% of the population who are essentially without purpose, I think a lot of what society looks like starts to change quite dramatically. I believe that a lot of people find it very difficult to understand what those numbers actually look like. And so if I remember rightly, employment at its peak in the US and maybe in the UK during COVID was between sort of 10 and 15%. Maybe in the US it was like closer to 15, in the UK it was closer to 10, but let's average it out and say it was like 12%, which is high, really, really high. Employment as at February of 2026 in the UK was like 5.5%, 5.3%. So we're not talking about suddenly a huge jump to find our society in crisis here, right? We're actually talking about effectively, if you take 10 people and currently, half a person is unemployed right now in Britain, that just needs to become one person, right? Like if 1 in 10 of the people that you know is unemployed, we have a social crisis, right? Especially given the way that we've built our society around welfare, around social values. And that, I think, is actually really quite scary. And I think the point that you're making, I couldn't agree with more. And it's interesting because it really is an ethical question, especially for people like myself who are working in the AI space, right? I think the moral dilemma for all builders in the AI space right now is your life's work can become something that is good short term, bad short term, good long term, bad long term, or variations of the two, right?
Yeah.
And you do have to segment it into short, medium, and long term. And I think the real challenge that we have, and I personally believe this is the most important question right now in the world, because I think we're heading somewhere that is unknown, is what you talked about at the start of this episode, which is what do we want our society to look like? Because if you know where you want to go, what the end state looks like, you can kind of start to engineer and work there. I think right now, the real problem we have is, as you described, we have a lot of people talking about post-abundance societies and all the benefits it can offer the individual and how that can be amazing, and robots that cook your lunch and you wash your plates and all these types of things, which sound amazing. But actually, that in-between period to get to all of that personal benefit is going to be very, very scary. And the real question, and this is the one that motivates me, and it's actually a big part of why we're doing what we do, is that there are, and I talk to my team about this a lot, I think there are two potential outcomes we see in the next 10 to 20 years. We either see this really amazing technology, which is getting better every day, come centrally controlled by the biggest companies in one scenario, or potentially by nation states, which some people might see as better, but history tells us central power, whoever owns it, is a bad thing. It doesn't matter, right? And then there is this third scenario where actually, how do we turn this technology into something that is truly democratized, that anybody can use, and essentially does the opposite of centralizing power? It enables the average person on the street to be able to get to that future. My belief is that that is the only path we have to the future we want. It's actually the opposite of where we're headed. It's this idea of how do we start turning local communities and individuals into participants in this change? Because if we are all participants in this change, if we are enabling companies to be able to control their own AI, which is the mission of our company, if we're enabling individuals to be able to use this technology, of course, that is going to have societal impacts. But at least if the individual is engaged, has a part to play, they can shape that future. They can be part of it rather than have it placed on them. I think the real danger we currently have in our society is that not enough people are involved in essentially being the counteracting force of a tide that is heading in one direction. This is why I'm a big fan of open source. I think open source is the most important technology movement, especially open source AI, likely in human history. That is my honest belief. And it sounds melodramatic, but because that will give people the tools that they can bargain with. Like right now, and we look at the last 50 years, what has been the power that the people have? Well, it's been bargaining of labor. That is the real thing that has been the counteracting force against something like a system of capitalism, right? Which has its good, has its bad. I mean, I'm a capitalist, I run a business, but it needs a check and balance. I think we're heading into a world where that bargaining power no longer exists. So it has to shift to something else. And that something else has to be actually about enabling the individual to be able to play a role in essentially how AI is shaped, how they can use AI in their own lives. That's my honest belief. It's like eyes on, focus locked in. Let's not fight the change. Let's own the change. Let us own it. Let us own it so that we control that power diffused amongst all of society rather than few control that power. I feel like that's the only way forwards, you know? And just to cap it off, because I do appreciate them, I'm going off a little bit, but I feel like there are two futures that we end up with in society. I think we end up with a future which is, I've mentioned this a few times, which is almost like if you've ever watched the film Elysium, right? Where you have two tiers of society. You've got those who have everything and they live in a parallel society, and those who have nothing, which is the majority of people. And that is where we're headed in our current trajectory. But then there is this other future for those who are particularly sci-fi buffs like myself, which is similar to what you've talked about. It's almost like the Star Trek future, right? It's this idea of like a post-humanist society where we are focused on things like flourishing, humanity, eradicating our biggest problems like hunger, eradicating war, exploring the stars, scientific breakthrough, charity, all of these values that give people fuzzy feelings that we want we want to represent as a species, but maybe our current system doesn't enable. Maybe in a post-abundant society, which is this transition we're heading through, can we be that society? I think now those are the two choices that we have, right? And the only way we get to the positive choice is if all of us are shaping it. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I certainly agree that Star Trek example is a really good one, because in the Star Trek universe, it's all about discovery, right? It's about charting the stars and making new discoveries and meeting aliens, and diplomacy over eradication, or nurturing over attacking and demolishing, destroying. So I think that it's a good picture, right? We need good pictures of where we're going, and I like to bring it back to the idea of the moon landing, right? So in the late 50s, 60s, there was this galvanized time where we were post-war, things were a bit crappy. But then we had this idea that we had this technology and we had this dream and we had this drive, and it was an attainable thing. We were in a situation where suddenly we had technology progressing and it was attainable to go to the moon, although completely batshit crazy when you think about it and go see the pods, and they got to the moon in that with no computing, this thing that hardly does anything, and now we've got these phones. So I like the idea that we have some sort of galvanizing moonshot idea that we can all move towards. And it sounds bonkers, but that, that Star Trek example, something like that, where we are giving people, sparking their imagination, right? And making it interesting to move towards this new situation, which hopefully includes this flourishing idea, right? We're not going to annex half the world's population to do this idea. We're going to bring everyone with us. So it should be a good idea, an idea worth doing, and something which is it sparks the imagination. Because I think part of that thing that I was alluding to, that idea about flourishing and doing exercise and socializing, all sorts of stuff, is that we're curious, we're intensely curious human beings. It seems like through history we've always been curious. So I don't think we should stop being curious. And part of stop being curious is this AI thing. I think we shouldn't stop doing the AI thing. I just think we should do it in a way which hopefully is more responsible, sensible, brings people with us, like you were saying, maybe open source and that sort of stuff can help with that, and is hopefully going to, in the future, be a better future, and not just like good in the sense that it works and is making me loads of money, but in the future, actually, no one has any money anymore and the whole society is fallen. Like that's the kind of thinking that is problematic at the moment, where it doesn't feel like these companies are in an arms race to be the king of a crapshoot, like a rubbish pile. Like, great, you have all the money. No one has any money anymore, so it doesn't matter. So great, well done. You've broken the whole thing.
That's very interesting. It's a really interesting point, and I feel like what I would deduce from what we've talked about is that it feels like this moment requires leadership, like global leadership,
Yeah.
global intention, and that is sorely missing, right?
And-
When I think of what you just described, which is, how do we get to a world where it is truly positive? It typically requires individuals or an individual to go, this is what the world should look like. I always think a good example of what can be achieved is when you look at like nations like Singapore, and like Singapore's, I think it was their first independent prime minister or president, and how he set a vision for that nation to go from being essentially a third world country that had nothing to one of the most prosperous and highest standards of living parts of the world, right? But there was a vision, and he had the whole nation behind it. It feels like me living in Britain right now, if we had a vision, if we had political leadership that said, look, the whole world is changing, everything is changing, everything that we currently talk to you about, the challenges that we have around welfare, the challenges we have around immigration, all of these challenges around they're all symptoms of the same problem, which is our prosperity is diminishing. Our ability to pay for the things that you are relying on that help you survive is no longer long-term sustainable. But look, we do have an opportunity to remake our society, to remake what we want for British people. Not just British people, but globally. But I'm talking about it from the British context because we both are talking from the UK, and not to offend the Americans or any Europeans or anyone from,
you can come too, just come over.
Whatever continent you're listening from, the African continent, the Asian continent. But, being a conversation between two Brits and knowing our current political climate, it feels like if someone could just really step up and go, hey, everything's about to change. The next 20 years are going to be dramatically different. We need to change. And I actually think that it's a really interesting moment for that because, political or not political, there's a lot happening in the UK right now. And I feel like the best way that someone could make that argument isn't the charismatic leader. I actually think it's local organization. I think a big part of it is how do we get people in their communities to understand the same things that we're talking about right now, which is the next 20 years are going to represent such significant change that you've got to own it. How do you think about that? How can local participation become a path to, the Star Trek future, so we avoid the dystopian feature?
So I've got two contradictory things to say about that. One, I think that we need a global government, and that's like a belief I've had for a long time. There are certain things which are bigger than the powers that be: plastic waste, the oil situation, curing some diseases, and worldwide health situations. They involve all of us. So I think we should have a governing body that no one needs to like, but they are, you know what I mean? They are at the top and help us coordinate, and that's their job, the coordination part. And then the contradictory thing that I'm going to say about that is, because I want to bring the world closer together, but I also agree that we should have greater techno sovereignty. And by that, I mean, stop giving all your money to America, literally. What is your email? Is it Microsoft or Google? What is your documents? It's probably Microsoft or Google. What is all the software that you use day to day? It's probably something that was made in America, maybe something in France or China. We need to stop siphoning all our money in that direction and start taking control over critical infrastructure, like communication, email. sending messages over these apps, WhatsApp, stuff like that. American company. I'm not saying that Americans are all bad. I'm just saying that it's not where we live, and it's not helping our security, and it's not helping giving us any power back. You know what I mean? So like, if we want to be on this equal footing with other countries, we actually have to have a footing to have, to be part of that, to have the power, right? So I don't think we should have power to throw ourselves around and demand things of other people, but we need it to have a voice at the table. I think it's absolutely bonkers that we don't have a governmental email. You know what I mean? Like some sort of communications infrastructure which doesn't go across the Atlantic all the time.
Yeah, it's a fair point. It's a fair point. And I think actually you're starting to see a trend of that. I think there's good and bad there, because I think you're absolutely right. Like there are certain things that the UK should just absolutely have control of. But then there are certain things that, if we're true, the Americans just do really well. But I think your point is a really valid one. I think it does kind of connect though a little bit. And where I probably disagree on the central government point is that I do worry that all central power is a problem. Like whether that's the large corporations dominating society or it's large governments dominating society. And I'll explain this as an entrepreneur. Increasingly, we live in a society that the government is more and more proactive about how it wants to shape the business environment. How many pieces of legislation that have come in that are really about trying to engineer society and business outcomes. And I can tell you, I think that type of dynamic where central power controls or tries to generate outcomes is also equally dangerous, super dangerous, because it starts to undermine, I think, many things that are great about a nation. But anyway, we're not going to turn into a conversation about politics.
Yeah,
I really do believe that, at the end of the day, when we go back to this point you make about flourishing and about self-actualization, fundamentally, who is best placed to be able to answer the question about what is self-actualization, what is flourishing? It's the individual, it's the community. And if we give the power all to large corporations, the example you gave, or even to large governmental organizations, I think we lose something. I think we lose our agency. And I think that is actually, in many ways, more dangerous than giving away our employment. Because at the end of the day, if we lose our agency and we're told what to do, where to be, how things should work, I think that strips us of our humanity more so than even some of the things that we're worried about in the mid to long term,
Yeah. I mean, I think I see where you're coming from, but what I disagree with is that the community can't do infrastructure projects. So I think it's a problem that the grassroots thing is, it's like a different echelons, right? Grassroots, yes. Give them power, give them money, give them tools, give them knowledge, give them responsibility. Like there wouldn't be rubbish everywhere if we had local responsibility. Like genuinely, like take responsibility, people, of your environment, your community. Do it. That's good. But that community isn't necessarily making train tracks. You know what I mean? It's just like there's like a higher level where you need some coordination.
Yeah.
So those big infrastructure projects is what I'm talking about. So if flourishing equals, we need to keep around computer chips, or we need to keep around someone to make, snooker cues or whatever it is. We need to coordinate. And at the moment, that's the market, right? So we have the market for that. And it may well, we have some sort of version of the market in the future. And the kind of techno industrialization hasn't kind of killed all physical things. In the short term, it doesn't feel like there's the robotics situation with AI is not great. So there's a lot of like physical work and labor that needs to happen. But in the long term, I think it really comes down to this coordination problem. Like, how are we going to make spaceships in the future? If we want to make spaceships, if your grassroots community wants to make a spaceship, you know what I mean? So you need these other strata of organized things that exist.
Yeah, but I don't think they're mutually exclusive. I don't think the idea of having local participation doesn't mean you can't have collective resources or collective planning. I think you can do those things. I think the thing that I'm really speaking to is let me give you an example. You live in a community, and in that community, you absolutely know that you need a community center for the children because the children don't have a place to go and teenagers are on the street and what have you. The reality of it is to build a community center, you probably only need like 20 people who are interested in making that a thing. And between those 20 people, they can raise funds, they can find a location. I mean, I see it in my own community. I live in East London. Like, there are so many things that my community want to do. Now, in Britain, we have a problem with local children community centres. The reality of it is that the community already knows what they need. They know how they can solve some of their problems. But in Britain, to get planning to do that might take you 4 years or 5 years. And it's like, that is because all of the control is governmental. What we're actually doing is taking away power and capability from the people who actually make the society.
Yeah.
That many things can't even work anymore.
So I'm going to stop you. So what I think you are doing here is you're confusing efficiency with autonomy, right? So your problem is that you are stipulated. So I think you're right. I think it is annoying, right? But in the future, where these efficiencies don't exist anymore, because the whole AI thing is about making things more efficient and cutting out the humans. So let's pretend in this amazing new scenario that you put in an application for a new youth center and it takes a minute because the AI is going to look at it and then it's going to tell you straight off the bat, no, because it doesn't meet these criteria or whatever. And then if it don't say no, it goes up the chain, right? And it takes a week. And at the end of the week, you get a yes or a no. Like this is the world that we need to be building, right? That we create these efficiencies where there is not the efficiencies, right? And we want to do that in a responsible, well-formed, well-educated way so we can create youth centers which don't fall down. That's the whole point of this. Like, we don't want to make things that any old Jim Beam goes and builds something and it falls down on some kids. That's the whole thing.
Yeah, it's a really good point. I think we'll wrap up.
Yeah.
But I'll say just a couple of points as a response to that. I think the efficiency point is a really good one, but it ties back to what we were saying earlier. Like, efficiency in our current world is all about incentives. And that's why the private sector is 100 times more efficient than the public sector, because the incentives are not there, right? And so as a society, if we want to move to this responsible AI and get these types of efficiencies you talked about, the incentives have to be aligned. And that means that, like, we need a grand incentive. I think that's where we agree, right? In terms of, like, the example I gave, and I appreciate it's a facetious point, I think that it's all a measure of degree. So you can go one way or too much over index and go another way over indexed. I think the real problem is we need a society, we need a culture where we can enable communities and individuals to really make the country more prosperous, to move it forwards. And if we have an assumption, I'm not saying that's what you're saying, but generally I think this is one of the challenges we have in Britain, is that we assume that the government knows best. The government understands. The government is competent. The government is thoughtful. And from my experience, my very few years, sometimes that's true, sometimes it's not.
Yeah, so I'll leave you with a distressing picture, right? So the fact that the government are less efficient might be the only place to work in the future, and that's a good thing.
You're right.
We'll lose all our jobs, and the only game in town is now local governments or government situation, because they are literally paying people still, and no one else is paying. So it's pretty bleak. I think what you're describing is coordination issues, and those are big issues. And I think AI is well primed to sit alongside those issues and help us all the way along. But I don't think it solves those human coordination problems itself. It's a global problem, right? How do you that's why we have different systems in different countries for governance and stuff like that, because it's just there's no easy answer.
I definitely agree on that. Ben, this has been so interesting. I feel like we could talk for another.
We could, yeah. Thanks,
to be honest. I think it's been so interesting and engaging, and I mean, we've agreed on a lot, disagreed on some, but it's been really good. Thank you so much for joining us in the AI opportunity. We're really, really grateful. I think it's going to make for a hopefully really interesting listening to the audience.
Great.
Thank you so much. We'll leave it there.
Thanks, Kenny. If anyone wants I'm also on the Machine Ethics podcast. You can find me there. Thank you so much for your time, Kenny. And I really appreciate your questions and your positive outlook. So thank you very much.